We're at the beginning of Chaf Amid Aleph, Amr of Yanai. The last thing the Gemara had said was the Gemara said a chiddush, that when you do Malika, Pashtus, you take your nail, you go through the spinal cord, and then the esophagus and the trachea. But there was a chiddush of the Bnei Rav Chia that you're able to take the esophagus and trachea, pull it to the back of the neck of the bird, and then do Malika that way. Either, two different versions, either that's how you're supposed to do it, or you can do it. Either way, it's an acceptable form of Malika. Here's the issue. The issue the Gemara is going to have is that the Mishnah lists the differences between Shechita and Malika. It constantly says, well, this is good for Malika, this is not good for Shechita, and vice versa. And then the Mishnah ends off. Kosher, the Mishnah ends off, it says, Nimtza kosher b'shchita pasul b'malika, kosher b'malika pasul b'shchita. The Mishnah ends off by saying that extra line, which is completely unnecessary. What is that line coming to include? So the Gemara says, Rav Yanai, Yikablu haroivin es truvasan. Rav Yanai said that the young men, Bnei Rav Chia, their pshat is going to be refuted from the Mishnah. Why? Because what does the Mishnah say? Nimtza kosher b'shchita pasul b'malika. The Mishnah says that which is kosher b'shchita is pasul by malika, and kosher b'malika pasul b'shchita. Now those lines are completely unnecessary. It's just a reiteration of what the Mishnah said. So what is it coming to teach me? Lemute mai. The implication of the Mishnah is lav lemute machzes simanim la'achorei ha'oref delo. Doesn't the Mishnah kind of say? The Mishnah basically says, it reiterates this line and it says something that's kosher from malika is pasul by shchita and vice versa. What is the Mishnah coming to tell me? What is the actual line? Is it not referring to the following case? If you take the simanim and the trachea and put it in the back of the animal and shecht it that way, is it kosher? For sure, right? If you move the simanim over here and shecht a cow, it's sure for sure to be fine. You're not touching the bone. Why not? What's the issue?
Because maybe it has to be in the front.
Why? There's no reason why. That pasha should be fine. So if the Mishnah is telling you there's one case which is kosher by shchita and pasul b'malika and vice versa, is it not referring to this case? That if you do that with the cow, it's fine, but if you do that with a bird, it's not fine. Why? Because malika has to go through the spinal cord before the simanim. So meaning in other words, what is the Mishnah referring to? There's a case of the Mishnah where it's kosher by one and not by the other. And there's a question mark, what is that case? Maybe it's this case. Kosher by shchita and pasul by malika. So you see that malika is no good in such a fashion. So the Gemara says, no, I'll tell you, again, we're looking for a case which is kosher by one and pasul by the other, either by shchita and not by malika or vice versa. The only thing we can think of is this case. You take the simanim, you put it at the back of the neck, and you shecht, it's fine, but by malika is no good. So the Gemara says, no, I'll tell you the case that it's referring to. A nail. If you do your nail, if you use your nail to do malika, is that good? Yeah, that's how you're supposed to do it. If you use your nail to shecht an animal, no good, because it's connected to your body. That's the case. Kosher by one and not by the other.
What about Shane?
Well, Shane, so Rashi says it's thrown in agav. It really shouldn't be referred to. It's siparin. Here's the issue, though. The problem is that's a Mishnah Mefurish in Daf Tezvav. You're right that halacha is true, but the Mishnah in Tezvav addresses that directly. That can't be what this Mishnah is referring to. Says the Gemara, Shane and Siparin and Siparin are addressed directly in the Mishnah earlier on. So that can't be what the case of the Mishnah is. So what is the Mishnah is referring to where it's kosher by one and not by the other? So it says the Gemara El Amr of Yirmiyah Lemute Moilich Umevi. I'll tell you the case. Really, if you do malika in the back of the neck with the simanim in the back, it's fine. What's the case where it's no good? Meaning, what's the case where by shchita it's good and by malika it's not good, or vice versa? I'll tell you, it's not the case, it's the motion. How do you shecht an animal? You take a knife, do you press down? No. You move back and forward, you saw back and forth. That's how you shecht an animal. How do you do malika? You take the nail and you push through. What if I take my nail and I do a sawing motion in the back of the neck of the bird? And I go back and forth, and I cut the bone that way. The chiddush of the Mishnah is no good, meaning the Mishnah is telling you what's kosher for one is pasul for the other is not the material, it's the motion. The motion of moving is good for shchita and not good for malika. It's okay. Here's the issue. That you're making an assumption that if you take a nail and you go to the back of the bird and you go back and forth, and sever it that way, it's no good. Is that true? Isn't that a machloikes, as we'll see in a moment? Says the Gemara, this makes sense that that's what the Mishnah is referring to. That is kosher by shchita. That movement is kosher by shchita, but not by malika. Is assuming that by malika it's no good. But elamanda amar kosher. But according to the opinion that you're allowed to do malika that way. By the way, it's a fundamental shayla that Rashi explains. The Mefarshim explain. What is malika? Is malika basically a type of shchita, using your nail? If it's a type of shechita using your nail, you definitely can go back and forth that way. For sure, that's how shechita is done. If you hold that it's not allowed, it's because malika has nothing to do with shechita b'chlal. But the point is, if you hold that it's kosher, then it's kosher by both. So that can't be what the Mishnah is referring to. So the Gemara responds, B'nei Rav Chia saber the command Amar Ma'ilcha maybe malika pasul. B'nei Rav Chia hold that moving that way is pasul. So they explain that when the Mishnah says kosher by one, not by the other, it's not referring to taking the simanim in the back of the neck, because that's kosher by both. The Mishnah is referring to the movement of the finger. Because they hold, if you move the finger back and forth, it's possible by malika, but by shchita, avada, that's kosher. By the way, the opposite is also true. Malika is pressing down, which by shchita is a problem. So the movement is kosher by one, not by the other. Now we're going to address this question, which is, again, if I take the nail and I go back and forth and I sever the spinal cord, that way, of the bird without pushing down, is that considered a kosher malika? So Amr of Kahana, mitzvah malika, kotzetz v'yoretz. Kotzetz v'yored, v'zuhi mitzvasa. Rav Kahana says to do malika, you have to press down, meaning no back and forth, straight. Savar Rav Avin l'meimar, kotzetz v'yored in molach u'mevi lo. Rav Avin explains Rav Kahana that Rav Kahana's chiddush is that it has to go straight down. You cannot go back and forth. Amar Rav Yirmiyah, kol shekein d'malach u'mevi kosher. No, malika is a form of shchita. If pressing down is kosher, kal v'chomer you can go back and forth. Umay, so what does Rav Kahana mean? Zuhi mitzvasa, ema af zuhi mitzvasa. When Rav Kahana said you could press down, he doesn't mean you have to press down, he means you can press down, but you could for sure go back and forth. The chiddush is you could even press down to do malika, even though by shchita that is not a proper form. Amr of Yirmiyah, Amr Shmuel, kol kosher b'shchita, kenegdo ba'orev, kosher b'malika. Whatever is kosher by shchita, if you go around the animal's neck and you go to the back of the bird, that's where it is. In other words, find the makam hashchita, go around the back, and that's malika. Okay. So the question is, what is he teaching me? I know this already. So it says the Gemara, he must be teaching me this. Ha-pasal b'shchita, pasal b'malika. That if this is the area that's kosher for shchita and kosher for malika, there's a case where it's pasal for both. What is he referring to? Lemute mai. Ilem lemute ikar simonim. Meaning, there is a case that Shmuel is telling me there's a case that's pasal by both. There's a case of shchita and malika that's an issue. He doesn't really tell us what case. The Gemara says, I'll tell you the case. What if the simonim become dislocated? So the bird dislocates the esophagus. It comes dislodged from its spot. His chiddush is, by shchita that's no good, right? If you take a cow and the simonim become dislocated and then you shecht it, it's no good. It's a problem. It's a treifa. But by a bird, he's saying it's also a problem. Meaning, when he's saying his chiddush is that there's a case that are pasal by both, that's talking about a case of dislocation of the simanim. Now, the reason why that's a chiddush is because when you're doing the malika, you're severing the spinal cord first. I could argue, I don't care what's going on with the trachea and the esophagus. You're not shechting it anyway. But he's saying that by pasal by shchita, it's pasal by malika. I.e., the case that he's referring to, that's an issue by both, is a dislocation of the esophagus or trachea. It comes dislodged out of where it's supposed to be. I actually think, I don't want to speak out of school, but I think that's what Rav Belsky had when he was very ill. Remember he was sick for a while, they added the name, but he got better? I think it was a dislocation of the esophagus or trachea. The point is, it could, God forbid, come out of its spot. So that's a treifa, but you can't shecht an animal that way. And the chiddush is, malika is also a problem. Here's the issue. Hatani Rami Bar Yecheskel. Didn't Rami Bar Yecheskel says, Ein ikar siman ba'of? That dislocation is not a problem at all. Forget about malika. You could take a chicken, even if it's dislocated, the esophagus, shecht it and you're fine. Meaning, unlike by an animal where it's a problem, by a bird it's not a problem b'chalal. So how could you tell me it's an issue by malika? It doesn't exist by birds, as we'll see in a moment. So the Gemara says, Amrav Papa, you're right. Meaning, so what's the case where it's possible by both? It can't be dislocation because Tani Bar Yecheskel brought a brisa that you could have a dislocated esophagus or trachea by a bird b'chalal. It doesn't matter. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you, Lamute Rosh. I'll tell you what the case is that malika is a problem, and that's the back of the head. In other words, what's the case where shchita and malika are a problem? If you do in the back of the head. Now I'm going to show on my head. The back of the head means like above the bone where you put the tefillin. So it says the Gemara, I don't understand. Rosho pshita mimul arpa rachmana. If you remember yesterday's daf, we said the spot is mul arpai. Arpai is the area where you put the tefillin, the knot of the tefillin. Mul arpa means below that. So what's your chiddush? That if I do malika in the back of the head, it's a problem? Of course, it's the wrong spot in the pasuk. The pasuk says mul arpai. So it says the Gemara below barosho. So I'll tell you outside, we'll see it inside. You know what the case is? The case is where you start too high, you do 1/3 of the malika too high, but then you press all the way down. By the time you end it, it's perfect. And if you remember, we had in yesterday's daf, by shchita, what if I start too high, and then I do the first third too high, and then I do the second 2/3 by shchita? According to one opinion, it's a problem. So the case where it's puzzled by both is where you start too high, and then you end in the right spot. Puzzled by shchita, puzzled by malika. That's the chiddush. Says the Gemara, my rosho, shipoy rosho, kagon de naka mi shipoy rosho. You started too high, but you push down against the slant. The higrim v'ozl adamata tatoi. You did the first third of the malika, first third of the spinal cord you severed too high, but then you pushed all the way down, and by the time you got to the bottom, it was in the proper spot. That's no good by malika, and it's no good by shchita. Why do I say it's no good by shchita? Kid Rav Huna Meravasi, we had this yesterday, Rav Huna Meravasi, higrish shlish. If you cut the first third too high by shchita, v'shachat shnei shlish, but then you did this 2/3 in the proper spot, puzzle, it is puzzle, because the animal's life force came out when it was not roib shchita in the proper spot. Okay, we said before, a few moments ago, that if the esophagus or trachea of a bird are dislocated, it's fine. A chicken, I'm not talking about malika, just a chicken. You could have a dislocated esophagus and trachea and then shecht, and it's fine. Here's the shaila. I'll just say it outside, we'll see it inside. Apparently, it's a shaila in the Tanoim, is shchita by birds doraisa or derabanan? You definitely have to shecht a bird. Shechting animals is halacha Moshe Sinai. I mean, there's a pasuk alluding to it, but the process of it is halacha Moshe Sinai. What's puzzle? What's kosher? Here's the question: are the same halachas by a bird, or is bird completely derabbanan? And is shechita by birds, the fact that you have to shech birds, and the fact that if you shecht it improperly, it's no good. All of that is that derabbanan, or is that halacha Moshe Sinai? It's a machlokes. So here's the story. It's derabbanan, yeah, because halacha Moshe Sinai. It was only. What do you mean? Minat Torah? Minat Torah, yeah. Yeah, Minat Torah. Yeah. Well, we'll get to it. This is in a week from now. We'll get to it. There's a daf in Chav Zayin that talks about it. So basically, here's the shaila. If you hold that dislocated is fine by a bird, does that indicate you hold it's derabanan or deraisa? Is it easier to understand shchita being deraisa halacha Moshe Sinai, and that's why dislocation is fine, or is it easier if you understand it's derabanan? I mean, if I tell you that animal dislocated esophagus trachea issue, bird dislocated esophagus trachea, that's fine. Out of those two, that bird is different than an animal. Does that make more sense if you believe that bird is deraisa, like an animal, or bird is derabanan and different? So the Gemara basically speaks out. I'll just say it outside. There's two different ways to look at it. You could look at it as if it's derabanan. It makes more sense. Why? Animals are deraisa. They have their halachas. This is derabanan. It has its halachas. Or you can make the following argument. Adarabba. If it's deraisa, it's halacha Moshe Sinai. Whatever reason, Moshe Rabbeinu heard from Hashem, animals are zoi, birds are this. But if you hold it's derabanan, it's modeled after a deraisa. Why would the derabanan be modeled after a deraisa and have different halachas? So the Gemara argues that if you believe that birds have a different halacha when it comes to the esophagus and trachea dislocation, it could be that you believe that it's deraisa, or it could just be that you believe derabanan. Either way, the Gemara speaks it out. That which Rami Bar Yechezkel said that ein ikar siman ba'of, that even if a bird has esophagus or trachea dislocated, you could still shecht it, unlike an animal. It only makes sense if you believe that shchita of a bird is derabanan. Go to the next page. Because if you believe that it's deraisa like an animal, yesh ikar. There's no reason, if they're both deraisa, they're both halacha Moshe Sinai, why would the halachas be different? Amar le, he responded, no, adarabba, the opposite. I think it's the opposite view. I think it only makes sense if you believe it's deraisa. Why? Because if it's deraisa, that means halacha Moshe Sinai. So for whatever reason, Halacha Moshe Messina is that animals are this way, and Halacha Moshe Messina is birds are this way. I don't know, it's kashas anyway. It doesn't make sense. It's above human intellect. Afilu man da'amar bebehema linin liquor lo yahavel behema. Elamad da'amar ein shchita of min haTorah. But if you believe it's the Rabbanon, where did the Rabbanon get it from? They modeled it after the behema, obviously. Why would Chazal take a concept, model it after it, and make it different? If the whole concept is derabanan, why would and it's modeled after the behema? So why would it be different? Where did the Rabbanan model it from? Behema, kula milsa behema. Then it makes more sense that it should be like a behema. So again, it's inconclusive. Amar Ravina, Amar li Ravin bar Kisi, Hadutani Rami bar Yecheskel ein ikr simanim ba'of. Lo amrin ela b'malika, aval b'shchita yesh ikr. He has a different opinion, which is dislocated pipes by a bird is a problem by shchita, but it's okay by malika. So when we said that dislocation by a bird is fine, that means for malika, because by malika you're severing the spinal cord first. But when it comes to shchita, it has to have the same halachas. But wait a minute. So you're telling me that dislocated pipes by a bird, it's malika fine, shchita no good. So shchita no good, malika fine. Wait a minute. Ha'amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Amar Shmuel kala kosher b'shchita kenegdo orev kosher b'malika ha'pasul. But didn't one second? Didn't Shmuel just say who started? Ravina. Ravina said that by malika it's fine if they're dislocated, shchita not. So let's just go through the things. Animal dislocated, no good. Bird shchita dislocated, no good. Malika good, according to Ravina. So according to Ravina, you have a case where malika it's fine, but by shchita of an animal is no good, and that's dislocated pipes. Here's the problem. Didn't Shmuel say the halachas are the same? Outside of placement, but the halachas are the same? According to Shmuel, it's either kosher by both or pasul by both. So why is Ravina saying that by malika it's fine, but by shchita it's no good? I thought they have to be the same according to Shmuel. You know, the answer is obvious. Ravina and Shmuel could argue. Both Amirayim. So the Gemara says, Ha'u pligi. They're Amirayim. They're arguing on each other. You're right. According to Shmuel, the halachas are going to be the same. If it's kosher by malika, it's kosher by shchita, and because it's pasul by shchita, it's pasul by malika. Ravina disagrees. So it's a machlekes. Amr Zeiri. Okay. Last halacha, and this is going to take us to the end of the daf. Zeiri says like this: Nishbra mafrekes. If the neck of an animal's neck breaks, v'roiv basar ima, and most of the flesh around it is severed. So if the spinal cord and most of the flesh around the spinal cord are severed, it's nevela. What do I mean? What I mean is like this. Of course, if you sever the spinal cord and most of the flesh around the spinal cord, the animal is going to die. That's pashut. The chiddush is, it's not going to die, it's dead. Meaning, when you have an animal that's dying, that's called treifa. If you shech the treifa, you know what it does? You can't eat it, but it does not have tumah. If an animal dies without shchita, that's called a nevela. It has tumah. So here's the case. I have an animal that's the spinal cord is severed, and most of the flesh around it is severed, and then I shech the neck. Now what the halacha is, it's not a good shchita. Meaning, it's not a treifa. The second the spinal cord and most of the flesh around it are severed, it is dead now. I don't care if it's flopping around. I don't care if it's moving. Instant death. Therefore, if you basically take the back of a cow, you cut through the spinal cord and most of the flesh, and then continue through the esophagus and trachea, that's not a treifa that you did a shchita. It's not a treifa, meaning let's say you do the neck, and then you cut the back, cut the spinal cord, most of the flesh, stop, go around and cut the top, cut the throat. The halacha is, that's not a treifa that was dying that you shechted. Because if that would be the case, no tumah. It's a nevela. The second you cut the spinal cord and most of the flesh, it's dead now. Done. Okay. By the way, what's interesting according to this, every malika, if you think about it, you're doing malika on a dead animal, not a treifa. The second you cut the spinal cord and most of the flesh, it's now death, before you get to the pipes. So it's kind of weird that every single time you're doing malika and you're severing the pipes, which is super essential, the animal's already halachically dead. The Gemara will point that out in a second.
Then how is it going?
Correct. Well, no, there's no tumah. The bird tumah only is by eating. So there wouldn't be a tumah issue. It would just be strange that the Torah would make you do a mitzvah on a dead animal. Like the Torah says, you have to cut the esophagus or trachea. It's like, dude, the animal's dead anyway.
If you're learning one out of the other, then
It's also strange.
that's the problem.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to it.
They sharpen their nails.
Yeah. It's a small bird. They use force. It wasn't easy. The Gemara says it was the hardest thing to do. We'll see why in a moment. The Gemara says, Amr Ziri, Nishbara Mafrekes, if the animal's neck bone is broken, Veroiv Basar Ima, and most of the flesh around it is also severed, Nevela, it is instant death. It's not a treifa, it's instantly dead. If you then were to sever it, it's nothing, meaning it's metama. Yeah, both. That's going to be the point. The Gemara is going to point out that the way you do, according to this, you have to do malika, is you have to sever the spinal cord without most of the flesh around it. So you'd have to have a very pointy nail, because if you cut most of the spinal cord with the neck, it's already a dead animal before you even get to the siman. The Gemara says, Rav Chizda says, Afananami Tanina. Rashi explains, although that lashon sounds like I'm backing you up with a Mishnah, he's actually asking, why do I need what you're saying? It's already a Mishnah. Meaning this is actually an ask. This is an attack. Says Rav Chizda, Afananami Tanina. You're telling me that when you cut the spinal cord and most of the flesh, it's instant death. I already know this. Why? Because what does the Mishnah say? Malak v'sakin. You take a knife and you cut the back of the neck of the animal. So you do malika with a knife. You know what the halacha is? Metame begodim abeis abliya. The halacha is that the animal becomes a nevela, meaning instant death. Says the meaning, and because of that, if you eat said animal, you're metame. Now, wait a minute. Again, what are you doing? You're cutting through the neck of the bird, and then through the esophagus and trachea. Now, if the animal is not dead right away, then what you did was you caused it to be a treifa, and then you did a shchita on a treifa. With a knife. You're using a knife. So again, you're cutting through. Now, if it's not instant death, then that means right now the animal is going to die. It's treifa. It has maybe a minute to its life. Then when you cut the spinal cord and the esophagus and trachea, you keep going, then you did a shchita. I mean, you did it backwards. You went backwards, but you did a shchita. So it should not be a nevela. The only way to make this make sense is if the second you sever the spinal cord and most of the flesh around it, instant death. So it was a nevela. I don't care what happened afterwards. It's already a nevela, that's why it's tameh. Meaning, in other words, the Mishnah is saying it's a nevela.
And hitting the bone and possibly the knife is not a...
No, it's a bird. It won't nick the knife. The Gemara says, the very fact that, again, you're basically doing a shechita just backwards. You're going through the neck of the knife, the neck of the animal, to the bird. Why is that? Again, and the halacha is tameh, meaning it's not a treifa with a shechita, it's a nevela. Why? Because in the second you cut the spinal cord, instant death. Because again, if it's a treifa with a shechita, then there should be no tumah. So the options are nevela, instant death, or it wasn't instantly dead. You made it a treifa, and then you did shechita. So there you go. The Gemara says, I'll tell you a third option. It wasn't instant death. Really, it's a treifa. So wait a minute. If it's a treifa, then you did a shechita. Because again, I mean, you went that way. So you did a shechita, but you did a shechita. You severed the spinal cord and the esophagus and the trachea. So why is that not a shechita? The way for it to be an avela is two options: either instant death, or it was a treifa without a proper shechita. Nevela means an animal that was not shechted properly. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why this is not a proper shechita, because you went backwards. Really, the animal didn't die right away. The second you cut the spinal cord with most of the basar, it's not instant death. It still has 30 seconds to its life. When you continued with the knife going forward through the simanim, that was not a proper shechita. Why not? Because you went backwards. So what? So says the Gemara, Amri, Hasam Mishum Dalav Shchita. That wasn't a proper shechita. So meaning it could be it wasn't instant death, but it wasn't a proper shechita. Why was it not a proper shechita? Two opinions. My time, Ravuna Amar, Mishay Neshu Machlid. One of the problems of shechita is called hachlada. Hachlada, if you watch in the video, is, think of this as the neck of the cow. So you're supposed to take the knife and cut it. What if I put the knife in and pull back? So halacha is that's hachlada. Hachlada means the knife is covered. When you insert the knife into the neck, it's covered. You can't see it. Then when you pull out, doing the Nazi symbol, that's when you cut out, that's called hachlada. So over here also, you started cutting the back of the bird. You went through the bird. It's not instant death. It's a treifa. But then when you finished it, it wasn't a proper shechita. Why? Because the knife was backwards. The knife was in the neck of the animal. Now, the only reason why this is not proper, classic hachlada, is because technically hachlada means the knife's not visible. Usually that means you stick the knife into the neck of the animal. At that moment, it's completely covered on either side. Over here, technically, the knife was visible because when you cut through the spine, there was an opening from the back. Meaning you could see the knife from the back of the animal. You just can't see it from the front. The Gemara believes that that's hachlada. Okay.
When last time the trump, if you're a third of the way through, most of your life you're not seeing it the whole time.
I would assume that because that's the proper way to do shechita, it's not called achlada. But the point is that the Gemara believes that that's an issue of achlada. Or a second issue, Rava Amar Pnei Shu Dairis. Another issue why it's not good shechita, to cut through the neck of the bird, you can't do that through a sawing motion. You do it through pressing. So if you continue going through the neck backwards, that's called pressing. You're not shechting, you're pressing. So says the Gemara, those are the two issues. Why does each opinion not like the other? Why does the opinion not like the opinion of Dairis? Why does he say machlid? Why doesn't he believe that it's pressing? He says, he says, why are you pressing? Oh, because you're doing malika with a knife and malika has to be pushed down? No, you could saw back and forth. The case is where you're sawing through the back of the bird and then you're sawing when you get to the front. You were assuming that it's pressing because he did a malika with a knife. And malika means pressing. No, you could saw for malika as well. So the case is sawing. Why does the other opinion not like hachlada, which is covered? The answer is hachlada is like a weasel that's living under a house, completely covered. I don't know, it's weird. But over here, it's not really covered. Because when you're cutting through the neck of the back of the neck, technically you could see the knife if you were standing behind the bird. Hachlada usually is where you're inserting into the neck of the animal and cutting. But over here, you're cutting back through. Technically, there's an incision point. You could see the knife from the back. Okay, just to finish up. Amar Rava, ikashali. Rava says, here's my problem. My problem is, again, we started this topic with Zeiri, saying that the second you cut through the spinal cord of the animal with roiv basar, it makes instant death. So we had a question that we said, isn't it mefurish in the Mishnah? The answer is no. But I'll tell you, says Rava, here's my problem. My problem is, then how are you doing malika? Every malika is severing the neck with the spinal cord, with most of the flesh, because that's usually how your thumb is. It's big, and it's covering most of the flesh, and the spinal cord. The animal's already dead. So every malika is on a dead bird. It's a strange thing. And the Torah has so many halachas that you have to cut through the esophagus and trachea. It's like the animal's already dead. So he says, ikashli. Well, you could just do malika on a dead bird? But that's what you're telling me. Because every time you cover the spinal cord and the roiv of the basar, it's already dead. That's the question. We'll finish up to get the answer. Before we get to the answer, the Gemara just goes back and forth. Abaya says, so then how do you do, what's your problem? First of all, by the way, I could just answer, yes, you do malik on a dead bird. It's strange. Okay, so there's the Torah. Let me ask you a question. When you do oilas ha'if, right, malik on the oilas ha'if, you have to cut the spinal cord and cut both simanim. You know what everyone agrees? The bird dies after the first siman. Birds are not as big as cows. Birds die after one siman is severed. So you sever the esophagus. The bird's already dead. You still have to sever the trachea. So it's also dead. What's the answer? Okay, I don't know, whatever. Every single time you do oil sa'if, you have to sever both simanim. So you say, whatever, okay, so it's dead after the first siman. There's, okay, fine, no. Whatever. It's like it's a mitzvah. That's what Hashem wants. Says the Gemara. Amrle, no. He says, he says, no. Over there, really, you killed the bird after the first siman. So why are you cutting the second siman? Not to kill the bird. You're just doing it because there's a mitzvah of havdalah. Havdalah means you have to sever the neck. You have to completely decapitate the bird. Meaning, the reason why I'm cutting, I cut the first one. I cut the spinal cord. It's not dead yet because we disagree with Zeiri. I get to the first siman. It's now dead. And now I did malika on a living animal and I killed it. Why do I cut the second one? I cut the second one because there's a mitzvah of havdalah. You have to decapitate the bird. But over here, at least I'm killing it in the malika process. Over here, it's dead before I start the malika process. The malika, the Gemara understands, is really connected to severing the simanim. At least over there, I killed the first simon. I killed it with the first simon. Why'd I cut the second simon? Because it's a mitzvah, decapitation. Okay, fine, it's a side mitzvah. But over here, you're not even doing malika on a living animal, on a living bird. It's dead before you even start. So says the Gemara, Ihachi arnami, wait a minute. If the whole purpose is decapitate, then shouldn't you also completely decapitate the bird? The halacha by oilas ha'oif is that you cut through the spinal cord, the two simanim, and then you let the skin hang out, meaning you let the bird's head stay connected on skin. So if you're supposed to decapitate it, then you should just decapitate a lagamri. Why are you not going? Meaning if you're telling me that there's a new mitzvah called havdalah, I killed the bird after the first simon, but it was a living bird and I killed it with my malika. So why are you doing the second simon? A mitzvah of havdalah. So shouldn't you completely decapitate the bird? Why are you letting it hang? So the Gemara says, skin doesn't matter. Why does skin not matter? Skin doesn't matter because it's not ma'akiv b'shchita. Let's say you have an animal that has no skin on its neck, you can still do shchita. Skin doesn't matter. So says the Gemara, yeah, but the shchita and havdalah and malika are not the same, because I'll tell you why. When it comes to shchita, you don't have to cut all the simanim, you could just cut roiv of it. But by malika, you have to cut it entirely. So if you have to go more than shchita, then you should also have to cut the skin. So the Gemara says, it's a slight difference. And then basically, what matters by shchita matters by havdalah. Skin doesn't matter. Back to the original question, though, we'll end with this. According to Zeiri, we got sidetracked with malika with an oil saif, but we have the problem. According to Zeiri, every single time you cut the spinal cord with roiv basar, it's instant death. So then every malika, the bird's already dead. So the Gemara says, Mikol Makom Kasha, it's a good question. The Gemara says, Amarava Ema v'cheinu oiseh chaytich shedra umafrekes b'loi roiv basar. You know what the answer is? You have to do malika by severing the spinal cord without severing roiv basar. So meaning, if roiv basar, let's say the circumference of the bird, the diameter of the bird is 3 inches, you have to make sure to cut the spinal cord and cut less than 1.5 inches of flesh of the bird's neck. Because it's dafka instant death when you do both spinal cord and roiv basar. You have to cut the spinal cord without cutting roiv basar, then kill the bird by cutting the simanim. Because you taka right, if you cut the spinal cord and roiv basar, the bird's already dead. So you have to make sure when you're correct. Cutting back. It's a good point. Going back and forth would definitely make it much more complicated. Maybe it's totally zebazah.